So today I'm thrilled to be joined by Nicki Kinton of Confident Cashflow. Nikki helps CEOs and MDs prevent late payments and boost cash flow, as well as creating robust credit management strategies to manage risk, improve financial agility, and support business growth. As trade business owners work off ever decreasing margins, it's vital that they maintain profitability. And in this podcast episode, we'll be discussing ways that trade business owners can use Nikki's strategies to improve their cash flow and profitability. So, welcome, Nikki. I'm delighted you're on the podcast. Thanks for joining me. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So just tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in credit control and your spark really for setting up your own business, Confident Cashflow.
Oh, yeah. So the story goes back quite a long way. So I left university after having trained to be a primary school teacher and decided that wasn't for me. So I was looking for a job, and I'd worked for my dad, who had his own accounting practice, and thought, oh, I can do that because I'd worked for my dad in the holidays and things. And I got a job in an accounts department of a large firm. Realised that I wasn't doing what I would have been doing with my dad, and actually realised that I was doing credit control, and I loved it, absolutely loved it. So instead of the route that I'd sort of planned for myself to go down and do professional accounting qualifications, I went and did credit control and credit management qualifications instead, and just worked my way up through to a point where I was managing some teams across the UK for businesses, £1 billion business. And I was the last port of call, and I was getting involved and dragged into lots of conversations with clients who were struggling with cash flow for one reason or another, that they couldn't pay us. Now my job was to get the money, but I found that actually what I really wanted to do was to try and help them to try to understand why they'd got a cash flow problem and then help them fix it. I am a natural fixer. So a friend of mine joked about, well, you should set up a business to do that. Go and help the smaller guys out there, because actually, they don't have the same access to the same information and tools and everything that the big corporates have. And having been inspired a bit by my dad, who had his own business, it was an idea that was appealing, but I thought it was a bit of, took it a bit tongue in cheek, and went home and told my husband, and he said, why don't you? So 6 years ago, after that conversation, Confident Cashflow was born.
Brilliant.
That I can take that best practice from credit management that the big corporates automatically put in place almost, and bring that to the smaller business owners.
And what's the journey been like so far? I mean, for a lot of businesses that started 5-6 years ago, they've obviously had that massive sort of earthquake in between, which was the pandemic. And you've come through that, which is great. How was that for you?
Well, I'm not going to lie, it was a little bit tough. So a lot of the strategy work disappeared, but I found myself actually doing a lot more terms and conditions work as that progressed, either through businesses who realised that they'd been trading for a long time without T's and C's, and so actually with a situation that we were all finding ourselves in, they probably needed to have some, or wanting to update them because they were having to change the way that they delivered on what they their services or their goods, so they needed to be changed to reflect that. And then a little bit later into the pandemic, I was writing them for new businesses as people had been made redundant or decided actually this wasn't for them, they were going to go and set up on their own. So it was quite nice to be doing it and writing these T's and C's for new ventures that were getting off the ground. That's quite exciting. So and now the strategy work is starting to creep back in again. So
yeah, and I suppose it's a warning to us all, really, the need to have cash in the business, the need to be really on top of your cash flow, because you just don't know what's around the corner. The chances are we will have another sort of pandemic. As much as nobody wants to think about it, you've got to plan for these things.
Yeah, you expect the unexpected, I suppose. We're finding ourselves in the middle of a financial crisis now. And whilst we may not technically be heading into recession is a mindset as much as it is a statistic from the government. So if you've got clients or customers who believe that they're going to get hit badly by a recession, their behavior will change, and then that behavior will cascade down to your business. So people will stop, if they decide to stop buying, then, you know, actually that could have a knock-on impact. So you need to be able to have some reserves in place to keep you going, and things like that. So I think we are lurching from one thing to another, and we've been in a situation pre-pandemic where actually we were in a time of relative boon. And if we're realistic about it, actually at the early days of the pandemic as well, trades went into a boom period because everybody was stuck at home and deciding they didn't like what they were seeing around the place, and were getting people in with the money that they weren't spending on going out and doing all that other stuff. They just started spending it on the home. So some of the trades, certainly, if they had the right mindset and got their acts together with things like the PPE and all of that side of things, they actually did very well out of it. And now, of course, people are starting to be a bit more cautious with their money.
So you work with a number of trades in your day-to-day business, and I'm really interested in understanding from you directly what you feel some of their biggest, in inverted commas, cash flow crimes that you see them commit on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
There are a few, and it does depend on the size of the business. So smaller trades, you tend to see that they take too much out of the business. So in drawings, so they tend to take a lot more out and not leaving anything in to cover any shortfalls. They see the immediate gain. They've been paid for a job, and they take out probably more than they would actually need. And it's about not understanding what you need for your personal expenses, and then making sure what you need to leave in the business for the business's expenses. So so that's probably one of them for that stuff, for the small businesses. For the slightly bigger trades, it's often not keeping a proper tab on what work's being done. And also, I've noticed with those businesses that are using a job management system, for instance, actually not closing off one job before, because they get so pulled into focusing on the next job. And if you don't close off a job, and it might only be one little task that needs to be done to close that job off, like issuing a certificate or something like that. But until that job's closed off in that system, you can't produce the invoice. And things like not logging the hours spent on a job properly and things like that. So then it becomes things like invoicing, which is always been a bit of a problem with trades. I think is that invoicing can be quite sporadic. Invoicing becomes then an even bigger, more onerous task, because you're having to check back on what extras you need to add in, what hours are spent on it, or what
easy to miss stuff, right?
It absolutely is easy to miss stuff, particularly if, I've been in situations where, personally, on the receiving end of it, where I've had some work done and I've not received the invoice for 3 months.
It's crazy.
And actually, and that's not uncommon. I hear that story so often. Now, your average person or business is not going to approach you and say, "Where's my invoice?" Because they can't pay you until they've received the invoice. So they're going to want to keep the money in the bank account as long as possible. So the danger is, of course, that particularly with some businesses and the domestic market, is if you don't invoice them quickly enough, that money will get spent on something else.
Exactly. And you've already paid for the materials, you've paid for the labor, you've paid for the travel, you've paid out. And to be honest, it seems to be a sort of a regional thing around the country. That's what I've tended to find anecdotally. The more sort of rural areas, a lot of it is based on trust. A lot of it is based on, we'll get your invoice out soon. Whereas in more sort of urban areas, I don't know, it seems to be a different mindset, I guess, because maybe, faster pace, I guess, comes into it. But it's about having the right processes and systems, isn't it?
It is. Absolutely. And, as part of that, systems and processes is having, designating time for various things. Again, one of the things with trades is you often end up with an owner of a business who spends more time on the tools than he does managing the business. And that can become a bit of an issue as the business grows. They need to be able to take that step back and have and be able to focus on managing the business. And they don't want to get, you don't want to get drawn into every little last detail and every little last decision. So having processes in place for you and for your team is really important.
Yeah. So we sort of touched on it a bit there about kind of the danger of late payment and how that can affect the business. And I know it's a big issue for trades. So, what can be done to sort of avoid late payments? And obviously, invoicing on time is one, but assuming, we get the invoices out on time, what can still be done to combat late payments?
So I think, one of the biggest things is preparation and conversations and making sure your customer has the right expectations. And we often, will go head first into something without actually having had that full-on conversation about the money. I always recommend with certain, particularly with domestic clients, that you ask the client where the money's coming from to pay for the job. So particularly if you've got a large building project, something like that, that's going to be in the tens of thousands or hundreds of pounds, actually you need to know how they're intending to fund it. You don't and asking the question, so is this coming from savings? Is it coming from a loan? Is it coming from bequests that you've made? Something, so at least you've got an understanding of how readily available that money is to them. Because the worst that can happen is that, well, actually you start doing all this work and then they suddenly say, we can't pay you because actually probate hasn't paid out yet. So you need to understand where the money's coming from.
I can imagine. Sorry to cut in. I can imagine some trades would be uncomfortable asking that question, but they've got to, right? They've absolutely got to if they want to improve.
Yeah, you got to put your big girl or big boy pants on and just go off and ask some of these questions. And if a payment is late, that's the other time you need to put those pants on, because we often end up hiding behind the emails and just sending another email or sending a statement or sending a copy of the invoice, that sort of thing. But actually, as soon as it's late, picking up the phone and asking for payment is really what you need to be doing, and saying and saying, why is this? What's stopping you from paying it now? That's the important question. What is stopping you from paying it now?
And is this something you help your clients with, chasing late payments, but not just chasing late payments, helping them avoid that situation in the first place?
Yes, so I do a small amount of credit control for clients. It's not my primary thing, but I do help. But if I'm working on a client with the strategy piece about the prevention, then one of the things that, as part of all that, is I'll help them to catch up with late payments and hopefully set them on the right track with some mentoring and training on making sure that if they do need to do that credit control piece at the end, that they've got the skill set and the confidence to do it. So as much as what I do is about prevention, sometimes it does happen, and so you need to be prepared for that. And just
give us a little insight into what's involved in a strategy for an average sort of trade business. How you would go about it, what questions you would ask, and what the process is.
Yeah, so I do a bit of an audit and on what they're currently doing. So what we need to do is to understand what's happening now. So, and that's obviously, and what results they're getting, and then where they want to be and then what's stopping them from getting there, or we can explore what the things that need to happen and what might stop them from doing those things. Time is often a big factor, but really the sort of questions I'll be looking at are just things like, when you get a new client, what do you do? You know, particularly, and this applies particularly when they're commercial clients for, you know, some of these trades. You know, what are you doing? Credit checks? Are you working out that these people can and are able to pay you? Or what communication questions are you asking right at the very beginning? And are you getting the right contact information and all of that sort of thing? And then about T's and C's. So what does it say in your T's and C's? Are you asking your clients to acknowledge them and come back to, you know, you accepting them, and making sure that everything in the T's and C's is right, so it covers you for the process for extras, for instance. So we all get it. You know, you've got the electrician in doing something or other, and you suddenly say, "Oh, while you're here, can you?"
Yeah,
and
the classic line.
The classic, yeah. While you're here, can you? And it's about being very clear right at that moment, and in that, you know, and whether that's you personally or one of your engineers or, you know, one of your guys or gals, actually making sure that they know what the process is, and having that process in place for dealing with extras or changes as well, so the variations as well. So, you know, oh yeah, well, we've decided actually we'd like to have this type of LED in here instead. And this many of them, and not realizing that, you know, they're going to cost an extra, you know, 20 quid a pop, and you want 10 of them, so that's an extra, you know, 200 quid. And the client doesn't necessarily appreciate that, and you need to make sure that they're aware that that changes the overall price of the job. So it's making sure they have a you know, process in place for dealing with that. And at what point then would you invoice the customer? Also cover what you want to do with payment, and how you would, you know, what action you can take if payment isn't forthcoming and things like that. So your T's and C's need to have all of that off, and cover all that up. And you don't just hand them to your client. You should talk to them a bit about them. Easier said than done with some, but it's just making sure that they're aware of certain key points, things like the changes, the payment terms, those sorts of things, so that the client is fully aware of what's expected of them and what they can expect from you. And I think that's one of the big things we often get is, oh, I didn't realize, or I didn't understand, or I didn't know. And that can cause some issues. And then about, you know, making sure you stay on top of the invoicing and doing making sure that, so we look at how you invoice, where, you know, when you invoice, that sort of thing. And we look at how you deal with any disputes, because disputes are one of the biggest causes of, you know, late payment. And I did have one client who wanted me to update their T's and C's to include all manner of things, which actually you shouldn't be putting in your T's and C's, but they were all basically based around a client being a bit of an arse. Is that, am I allowed to say that?
You can say that, absolutely.
But you know, actually that goes back to communication. You can put so much in your T's and C's, but actually the communication piece is the bit, and that really helps prevent there being issues if there are, you know, if there are any queries or disputes that arise, and it's how you handle those that really makes the difference. So customer service is key. And then what to do, you have a strategy around what you do in the event that you don't get paid. And the reason that you have a strategy is that it's quite an emotional thing, particularly, you know, if it's your business, it's your money, so it can be quite emotional, and can, feelings of stress, panic, anger, all of these things can happen to us when we don't get paid. But if you've got a process, instead of going into full-on panic mode, you can sit down and say, right, what's my next step? I've got this written down, I've got a checklist, right, this is my next step, so this is what we do next. And then if that doesn't work, well, this is what we try next. And so by having that process in place, you take the emotion out of it, so you remove the delay that you would normally get by dealing with that emotion, and you can just crack on. So there's lots of things in that strategy piece.
Yeah, this is brilliant. This is great. So, you know, we're at a point now where, you know, we've got the strategy in place. You know, we've got a better sort of cash flow happening in the business. We're helping to remove late payments. We're making sure that we're billing for all the extras, and this is creating a really healthy cash flow, healthy profitability in the business. One of the things we talked about earlier was making sure that that there's that we have a buffer. So if there is a bit of a crisis that lands, and whether that be of external making or internal making, like a big VAT bill or salaries. It's really important, isn't it, to have a buffer in the business for those essential costs and some hidden, things that happen in the business. But in practice, how best can trades do this? How can they make sure that they separate money in their business to make sure that they're planning effectively?
Yeah. So I would highly recommend a book called Profit First by Mike Michalowicz.
Yeah.
So it's a really good book, and it talks about taking the profit out of the main account first. Then you take out what you need for your salary or your drawings. Then you take out, you've removed the VAT, and you take out another little bit for the tax man for your corporation tax or self-assessment tax, whatever that needs to be, and then you're left with a balance which is for your expense, to cover your expenses. And what we need to do is make sure that that bit to cover your expenses will last you for 3 to 6 months. Okay, now and that's 3 to 6 months of your fixed expenses, so the ones that so if you were to not be able to work for 6 months, or if something happened and the business had to down tools for 6 months or whatever, that actually those expenses that you can't get out of, that you still have to meet, will be covered. And so 3 months is good, 6 months is healthy. Really. And if you have a bank account with somebody like, certainly some of the online ones like Starling.
I know Starling doing Monzo, I think.
And Monzo,
as well.
you can use this, what they call the spaces or pots, to siphon these off into. The first thing you should always take off is the VAT, because that's not yours. That belongs to the government. So take out the VAT, put that somewhere else, put that to one side. Now, obviously, you'll be paying out VAT on things that you can claim back. But what that does mean is that when you come to pay your VAT bill, that VAT account should have more in it than you need. In which case you can, take that balance and either pay yourself a dividend, you can put it back into the expenses pot and use that to build your buffer. But if you siphon off the VAT from every invoice and put it into one place, then you'll always have enough to meet the tax, the VAT man side of things. And they say you've probably got, because you'll be paying out VAT on materials and things like that, that actually you'll build yourself a bit of a buffer in there. Then, but if I personally, I've used I've created some instant access savings accounts, and I put mine into those, and then that allows me to gain a little bit of interest at the moment. But either way works. The thing you've got to be, there's a bit of discipline required, is to not go and raid them. When because you feel like having a bit of a blowout or something like that. So so that's really that. I mean, the book is a really good book. Yes. If you're not a big reader, Mike does a really good audio book version. You probably get a few extra stories in there because he's a great storyteller. But it's definitely worth a read or a listen. So
we read the book. I'm part of a sort of a kind of an online book club, and we read the book last year, and I have to say it totally transformed how I structure my business and actually personal finances as well, because Profit First, it obviously leans towards business, but you can also apply the same principles in your personal life, and that was one of the biggest moments for me last year of where my life really started to sort of change for the better, was when I was separating out all my bills and expenses into one pot, and then knowing what I had left over. And then I've started to apply the same principles. So I bank with Starling, and you have that ability, like you said, to create different pots, so you can separate out, the VAT to salaries and tax and other sort of expenses. It's totally transformed how I run my business.
It is, yeah, absolutely. And the other great tool for making sure that you have the right buffer is to create a cash flow forecast. And so, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It depends how big your business is, but it could just be a bit like a bank statement, except you're looking into the future instead of looking back. So you have a date, a column for dates, a column in, a column out, and a running total column. And you basically add in your invoices, your future invoices, you add in all your expenses. Now, some of those recurring ones are easy to add in. Obviously, cost of materials and things are a bit harder to add in because that's a per job basis, but you can estimate based on what you've done in the past.
Sure.
Obviously, I always say keep a cash flow forecast for at least 3 months. 6 months is good. 12 months is fantastic. Now, obviously, the further down the line it gets, the more inaccurate it's going to be because your business, so many things will change. But actually, if you can see that at the end of this month, I'm going to run out of money unless I do X, Y, Z. So if I can bring that invoicing work, that invoice forward for whatever, so whatever it takes to be able to invoice that earlier, i.e. get the work done or get something else done, or I can need to push back those expenses, that expenditure, then you've got more chance of making sure that you're not left with a panic at the end of the month.
Yeah, totally. I totally get that. Just before we sort of wrap up, I'm just interested. We touched on a little bit on the importance to have the right terms and conditions in place. For the tradies out there, what would you say are the essential T's and C's to start with in their business if they don't have any?
Yeah, well, if they don't have any, the big thing is, yes, you absolutely should. So one of the things that I do find is that if businesses they often go and try and copy somebody else's, or then they'll try and cut out loads of stuff because it looks too off-putting or anything like that. What they do is they end up cutting out all the stuff that makes them legally enforceable. And gives them most of the protection. Your T's and C's should really clearly lay out, I suppose, several sections. There are obviously the contract, so when it starts, and what's involved. So you don't have to detail the job because that would be in your quotation, but you need to, the fact that things like whether you use subcontractors or not, so that the client is aware, whether you will work evenings and weekends, that sort of thing. So be very clear on that, those sorts of things about when you're prepared to deliver on the services that you're offering. Notifications of any sort of call out fees or anything like that you might have if you're that type of sector. If you're dealing with consumers, the domestic, then there are a number of things you need to have in there by law. So you need to have something about any goods you supply. You need to have some things in there about the guarantees that you have for the goods. You also need to have in a cancellation clause that because consumers have a 14-day right cooling off period, if you like, to cancel the contract from when they. Well, it's different actually. If you're providing goods, it's as part of your service, then it's from when they receive the goods. If it's for the service, i.e. going in and doing some work on property, then it's from when the day after they agreed the contract, basically. And you have to give them that right. It's a legal obligation. If you do any work for them within that 14-day period, you can charge for that work. That's fine. But you also need to be clear on your things like your payment terms, payment methods that you accept, what the consequences of late payment are. So will you down tools? Will you charge interest? Or what all those sorts of things. You need to have what your defects and complaint policy is. So what do you do about defects and any guarantees that you've got? What's your complaints policy? You need to have things in there around things like force majeure clause. So is so important. That's basically events beyond your control. So people with an incomplete force majeure clause were struggling a bit when the pandemic hit, because that's an event beyond your reasonable control. Also, liability. What are you liable for? You need to limit your liability. If you don't put anything in there, then somebody sues you. They could sue you for all sorts of amounts of money. So it's always good to try and limit the liability to the price of the contract, the total value of the contract, if you can. But you can't limit your liability for certain things like death or injury through your negligence. You might want to put in there things about how you would treat health and safety. You might want to put in there about sort of what you expect from the customer to do in preparing the premises, for instance. So removal of furniture, if you're having to work alongside other trades, you might have stuff in there about timings, and that you can't be liable for any delays if you're a second fix, for instance, and you're waiting on somebody else to do something and they're running late, so that you can't be held liable if you can't start when you plan to start because somebody else has not finished their bit. All sorts of things in there that you need to consider. So it's I would always advocate getting some written for you.
That's exactly what I was just about to say.
Rather than trying to navigate all of that on your own.
Yeah, I think, in those few moments there, you pretty much summed up and summarized why somebody needs to get in an expert to do it for them, because there is so much to consider. And it's the sort of thing that I guess you don't know you need it until you need it, right? And if you've done exactly what you said at the start, which is copied somebody else's, you're going to find yourself lost, essentially, because it's not covering your business the way it should, right?
Yeah, and to be, aside from copying somebody else's being copyright theft, actually, it's not necessarily going to cover everything that your business does in the same way that you would do it. And also, you might not understand them. Whereas if you work with somebody to write you some, then you will get involved in a lot of conversations about all the things that could happen with your business and what you could, how you're structuring your business and how you want it to work, such that when you've got a set of T's and C's, you know what's in them, you understand what's in them, and you can explain them to somebody else, because you need to be able to do that.
Yeah. So just before we wrap up, firstly, thank you so much for joining me on the Happy Tradie podcast, Nikki. I think some of the information there is so much to unpack. Each time I do an episode with a guest, there's always so many nuggets that are just worth kind of rewinding and listening back to. And there's so much in there for tradies. And if nothing else, it starts the journey for them to get their house in order. There's a lot there that businesses can do to control, what's within their abilities to control. So thank you so much for sharing. There's so much great advice there. The final question that I always like to ask people on the podcast, and the name of the podcast, the Happy Tradie, is all about giving them the tools and the expertise they need to run a better business, so that it does give them, that ability to have a happy life. So in that vein, what defines happiness in your life? What's your kind of definition of happiness or happy place?
I think, a happy place for me, I can go straight to a happy place, is my music. So I'm a classical musician, and it's my go-to thing if I need to de-stress. It's my go-to thing for social life, my social life and everything like that. I think overall about being happy is about being able to be positive and be content with the things around you, and having those positive interactions and good relationships. I think that to me is about being happy. It's not about how much money you can earn or how many possessions you've got, but it's about the experiences you have and the people that are around you.
I think that's a lovely way to wrap up this episode. Nikki, thanks once again for coming on the Happy Tradie podcast and sharing your expertise and wisdom.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.